Today's scripture passage comes from Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. Hear the word of the Lord. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So I'm excited to have the opportunity to share with you today. This is my first opportunity preaching since I've been here at Epworth, and every time I preach in a new church, I always like to share the story of the first time that I ever preached a sermon. And it happened when I was in high school, the summer in between my sophomore and junior year, in college. The summer in between my sophomore and junior year in college, I was part of a ministry team that worked in Yellowstone National Park. And our job was to put on various worship services throughout the park every Sunday. And as we prepared for our first service, for whatever reason, I don't know what I was thinking, but I volunteered to preach at that first service. And as we were preparing for the service, and it was set to take place in this beautiful outdoor amphitheater that was probably about half the size of our sanctuary here. And I wrote my sermon, and I was ready to go, and as I walked up to the front to preach and looked up to start talking, a grizzly bear ran into the back of the amphitheater and stopped, and I promise you he looked right at me. And so if you can imagine the scene, it's just like it is now. I'm standing here looking this way. Everybody else was looking at me, and I'm standing there slack-jawed, probably the blood draining from my face, and I think everybody probably just thought I was too nervous to preach. Luckily, there was a backcountry ranger sitting in the front row, and he kind of sensed something was off, and he looked back and saw what I was staring at, and he said, "Just let it be, and he'll move on." Okay. So after about a minute, the bear did move on, and I was able to get through the sermon unscathed. But I like to tell that story. I think that was a really important experience for me to have in my first sermon, because now, no matter how intimidating any given congregation might be, nothing will be as intimidating as getting stared down by a grizzly bear. But you're all very nice and kind here, so I don't think we have to worry about that today. So last week, Scott talked about the miraculous feeding of 5,000 plus people by Jesus when he multiplied the fish and the loaves. And the story that we read today is what happened immediately after that miraculous feeding. So Jesus multiplies the fish and the loaves. The disciples pick up 12 baskets of leftovers. And then immediately Jesus pushes the disciples into a boat and says, "Meet me on the other side of the lake." You may remember that before the miraculous feeding, Jesus was actually trying to go find a place to rest and pray and kind of re-energize himself. But then he came upon the crowds and he had compassion on them, and so he delayed taking that rest. So now the crowds have been fed, the disciples have been sent off, the crowds have been dispersed, and Jesus finally has his opportunity to go up the mountain alone and rest and pray. And by the time Jesus is ready to rejoin the disciples, they've been out in the boat for quite some time, and they're way out in the middle of the lake, probably as the furthest point away from shore that they could possibly be. And some other translations of this scripture tell us that it was the fourth watch, which was between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. And so the disciples are out there on the boat being driven by the wind, and they see this figure striding towards them on the water. Now, if you've been around church for a while, you've probably heard this story before, and so it's probably not all that surprising to you. But just take a second, put yourself in the disciples' sandals, okay? You're out there on the boat, early morning, it's gray, it's windy, it's stormy, and all of a sudden, you see this human figure walking towards you on the choppy waves like he's taking a walk in the park. What kind of emotion would that instill in you? If you're having trouble coming up with a name for that, I think I would characterize it as all-out wet-your-pants terror, okay? That's right. So how is it then that Peter goes from this kind of fear to actually being willing to step out of the boat and walk on top of the water? There's a great book entitled, If You Want to Walk on Water, You Have to Get Out of the Boat, by John Ortberg. And in this book, he tells the story of the time that he and his wife went on a hot air balloon ride. Anybody ever been on a hot air balloon ride? Okay, we've got a couple. I haven't, I'm terrified of heights, but so he said, and after reading his story, I'm sure I'm never going to do it, but he said that he always assumed the baskets on hot air balloons were, somewhere around chest high. The one that they were in was only about knee high. And he said he was thinking about how one good lurch of the balloon would send them over the side and plummeting back to the ground. Not exactly what you want to be thinking when you're 1,000 feet up in the air. So he decided it would be a good idea to kind of interact with the pilot of the balloon to make himself feel reassured that they were in good hands, right? So he starts talking to the guy, and he says, so how is it that you got into piloting hot air balloons? And the guy's response started with, dude, see, it's like this. And he said, at that moment, I knew we were in trouble. Turns out this pilot spent most of his time surfing, didn't have any career aspirations, but the most chilling part was when he explained how exactly he had gotten into flying hot air balloons. Turns out, he was driving his pickup truck drunk one night with his brother in the truck, and they had gotten into a serious wreck, and now his brother was badly injured and couldn't get around very well. And so his brother liked to sit and watch hot air balloons fly. And so he figured, well, if my brother's going to be sitting here watching this, I might as well learn how to fly him. And then, to top it all off, he added, by the way, I've never actually flown this particular balloon before, so I'm not quite sure how choppy the descent will be. Unlike Ortberg's, by the way, they made it down okay. To summarize, though, they were 1,000 feet up in the air with an unemployed surfer who had never flown that model of balloon before and who had started flying balloons because of the fact that he was driving drunk and injured his brother. Doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in the pilot, right? But unlike Ortberg's story, Peter trusted the character of the one who held his life in his hands. After the disciples start screaming, there's a ghost, right? Jesus says, fear not, it is I. And this it is I phrase is actually really interesting here because it's actually the same phrase that's translated I am, which connects to how God identifies himself to Moses in the burning bush. Jesus is clearly identifying who he is right here. And upon hearing that, Peter says, if it's really you, command me to come to you. Now, it's important to note here that this event of Peter stepping out of the boat was not initiated by Jesus. Peter initiated this event of stepping out of the boat. Peter asked Jesus if he could do the impossible, if he could help Peter walk on water. What are you asking Jesus to do? What are you asking Jesus to help you do? Are you content to sit back and watch others step out of the boat? Or are you asking to be the one to step out? Are we, as the church, asking Jesus to let us step out in faith? Or are we like little Johnny in the video we watched this morning, content to do the same old thing year after year because we're afraid that if we step out, we might look foolish? Peter asked to step out. He recognized that walking on water wasn't something he was going to do of his own volition, right? That's why he asked Jesus to command him to come. And Jesus says, "Come." And again, put yourself in Peter's position here for a second. How much faith must it have taken to swing one leg over the side of the boat and swing the other side over and take those first few steps on top of the water? I have to imagine that that's probably the most amazing experience ever. But a couple seconds into it, Peter realizes what exactly it is he's doing and realizes that for all intents and purposes, he shouldn't be able to do that, right? And that's when Peter begins to sink. Notice the order of events here. Peter doesn't start to sink and then become afraid. Peter starts to fear, and that's when he begins to sink. The fear causes the sinking, not the other way around. And there's actually a fun play on words here that we as non-native Koine Greek speakers miss out on. Peter's name was originally Simon, and Jesus changes it to Peter. Actually, he would have changed it to Cephas, which is the Aramaic version. But in Greek, the name Peter comes from the word Petros, which means rock or stone. So Peter, whose name literally means rock, does exactly what rocks do when you drop them in the water. He starts to sink, right? And there are interesting implications here for the church universal. Because when Jesus renames Simon as Peter, he tells him, "On this rock I will build my church." And later on, we see Peter becoming the very active leader of the early church. So in some ways, Peter is not just representative of us as individuals, but he's representative of the church as a whole. Stanley Hauerwas, a famous theologian and former professor at Duke University School of Divinity, said this: "The church is the ark of the kingdom, but often the church finds herself far from shore and threatened by strong winds and waves. Those in the boat often fail to understand that they're meant to be far from shore, and that to be threatened by a storm is not unusual, because if the church is faithful, she will always be far from shore. And some, moreover, will be commanded to leave even the safety of the boat to walk on water." At times, the church has faltered throughout history. The faith of the church has faltered, the actions of the church have faltered, but Christ will not let us sink. A few weeks ago, we had a funeral here, and Scott said something that day that I think was right on the money, and I'm not just saying that for brownie points, but I do like brownies. But what Scott said is, so often we think of death as the enemy of life, and it's not. The real enemy of life is failing to truly live. I think we can say the same thing about the church. Fear dominates us when we think that preserving the church is our job. It's not. That's Christ's job. Our job is to be faithful witnesses in the places that Christ has called us, trusting that he won't let us sink like a rock. And so I've heard sermons on this passage many times before, and a lot of the time people want to start bashing Peter at this point because he started to doubt, right? "Oh, Peter, ye of little faith." That's what Jesus says to him, right? "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" But I think we miss the point here if we only want to focus on Peter's doubt. Because what does Peter do when he starts to sink? He cries out to Jesus to save him. Even though Peter starts to sink after Jesus called him out on the water, Peter still trusts Jesus enough that he cries out and he trusts that Jesus will reach out and save him. And so Peter doesn't wait until he's 100% perfect or 100% sanctified or 100% free of doubt before he asks to be allowed to take a step of faith, right? Sure, he doubted that he could walk on water. Can you blame him? But what he didn't doubt was that Jesus was going to reach out and catch him. Even though his faith was wavering in that moment, he did not hold back from crying out to Jesus. He knew that even though his faith had failed, even though he showed his inconsistency, Jesus was not going to let him drown. Do we trust Jesus enough to step out of the boat knowing that even if our faith falters somewhere along the line, Jesus still loves us and he won't abandon us to the waves? We're finite humans, and we're always going to have finite faith this side of heaven. We're going to have doubts, and that's okay because doubts are part of the journey of faith. But faith, when placed in Jesus Christ, is stronger than any doubts that we can ever have. The question is, do we believe this? There's an author named Brennan Manning, author of the best-selling book Ragamuffin Gospel. If you haven't read Ragamuffin Gospel, leave here today and go find a copy of it and read it. Fantastic book. But Manning said this. He said, "Honestly, the God of so many Christians I meet is a God who is too small for me, because he's not the God of the Word, he's not the God revealed in Jesus Christ, who at this moment comes right to your seat and says, 'I have a word for you.' I know your whole life story, every skeleton in your closet, every moment of sin, shame, dishonesty, and degraded love that has darkened your past. Right now, I know your shallow faith, your feeble prayer life, your inconsistent discipleship, and my word is this: I dare you to trust that I love you just as you are and not as you should be, because you're never going to be as you should be." Peter didn't hold back saying, "I'm not as I should be." Peter didn't hold back saying, "Boy, I might get out on top of those waves and start to doubt, so I probably shouldn't take the step of faith in the first place." Peter didn't hold back saying, "What if I get out there and I sink? Is Jesus going to save me at that point?" Peter trusted. Peter trusted the love of Christ, and he knew how grand that love was and what the implications of that love were. So what's the end result then of Peter's decision to step out of the boat? We're told that when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Now, remember, this isn't the first miracle that the disciples have seen from Jesus, right? I mean, less than 12 hours earlier, they had seen him multiply the fish and the loaves and all of that. In fact, I have to believe that that was probably a topic of conversation as they were on the boat. Did you guys see that? What just happened? You know, this wasn't the first miracle. This wasn't the first time they had seen nature respond this way to Jesus, because a few chapters earlier in Matthew chapter 8, we read about how Jesus calms a storm when the disciples are afraid that their boat is going to capsize. And in that particular story, when they're worried that their boat's going to sink and Jesus calms the storm, they say, "Who is this man that even the wind and the waves obey him?" They're wondering, who is this guy? But now, after Jesus has walked on water and given Peter the ability to walk on water and rescued Peter from sinking like a rock, everyone in the boat worships and proclaims Jesus is the Son of God. When we step out in faith, people may think we're being foolish. When we step out in faith, people may ridicule us. Why did you do that? What were you thinking? Why would you step out of the boat? How could you move your family from western New York to central Oklahoma? Don't you know there are tornadoes there? But when we step out in faith, the result is that people see the glory and power of the Lord and cannot help but praise him. Peter stepped out of the boat and Jesus showed his power in multiple ways. Peter demonstrated his inconsistency, but Jesus demonstrated his consistency. For me, this brings to mind something that the Apostle Paul says in 2 Corinthians. He's been asking God to remove a thorn from his flesh, some sort of cause of suffering and weakness. And Paul wrote, "But God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." After which Paul proclaims, "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." And this is why the gospel of Jesus Christ is such good news. Who we are truly has nothing to do with our accomplishments or our potential or our behavior or our strengths or our weaknesses or our past or our present or our future. Our identities are fully, completely, firmly anchored in Jesus Christ. Because Jesus won for me, I'm free to lose. Because Jesus was someone, I'm free to be no one. Because Jesus was extraordinary, I'm free to be ordinary. Because Jesus was strong, I'm free to be weak. Because Jesus succeeded for me, I am free to step out of the boat. Because even if my faith falters when I'm walking on the sea, Jesus will not let me sink. So I told you at the beginning of this sermon about the time that I spent in Yellowstone as a member of a ministry team. What I didn't tell you is that this experience almost didn't happen for me. Going to Yellowstone was a big step out of my comfort zone because I had never really been away from home before. And here I was preparing to spend 3 months, 2,000 miles away from home. Before arriving, we had to go through a training session to teach us how exactly to go about the ministry there. And I met somebody there named Brian who was going to be a member of my same ministry team in Yellowstone. So I thought, all right, great, I'm going to know one person there. And Brian and I decided that we would room together because that way at least we would be rooming with another member of the ministry team, and our room could kind of be our safe haven rather than rooming with somebody we didn't know and somebody who might not be a member of the ministry team. And so when we got there and I was registering, I was talking to the folks at the housing department, and I said, "Oh, I'd like to room with Brian." And the woman went over her list and then went over it again and then went over it again. And she said, "I'm sorry, I don't have anybody by that name on my list." And I said, "No, he's got to be on there. I know that he's on that list. We're going to room together." She went over it again. She said, "No, I'm sorry." And I said, "Well," I said, "I'm sure he'll be showing up. So, what can we do to make sure that we can room together?" And she said, "Well, here's what I'll do. I've got a guy who's in a room by himself right now. And he's actually going to be moving into a room with another guy in a couple of weeks. So until then, you can room with him, and if Brian shows up, you guys can move in together a few weeks into the summer." So I thought, all right, I can probably handle that. So in the meantime, my roommate was going to be a guy who went by the name Pee-wee, which was, of course, an ironic name because he was about 4.5 feet tall and weighed 400 pounds. He was the cook in the employee dining hall, and he was not a member of the ministry team. And so when they let me into my room to start to move all my stuff in, my room, my safe haven, was covered with all of these little Dixie cups full of tobacco spit. I can tell you my faith was faltering at that point. And my dad made the trip across the country with me, and we were sitting on the picnic table out in front of the employee housing building, and he told me a couple of years later that he was convinced that we were going to begin the trip all the way back across the country that day. And we were sitting there, and I was kind of lamenting, trying to figure out, oh man, what have I gotten myself into here? And a tour bus pulls up in front of the building, and my dad says, "Wouldn't it be awesome if Brian got off that bus?" Yeah, right, whatever. So people start filing off, and who should get off? but Brian. I said, Dad, it's Brian. And he said, are you serious? Yeah, and so, I only had to room with Pee-wee for about a week, and, we tolerated each other's presence, and that was okay. But then I got to move in with Brian, and everything went smoothly for the rest of the summer. But in that moment when I saw Brian get off that bus, Jesus kept me from sinking like a rock. So my challenge to you today and throughout this upcoming week is that you would pray for God to show you areas of your life where you can step out in faith. Just be prepared that stepping out of the boat, obedience, doesn't always mean smooth sailing or smooth walking, as the case may be. When I asked God to help me gain experience in pastoral ministry, it meant coming from New York to Chickasha. A couple of times through the packing and moving process, I wondered if I was doing the right thing, but I can tell you that every time I began to think that way, God caused something to happen that let me know that I was in exactly the right place that He wanted me to be. And my prayer is that that will be the same experience that you have as well, because all things are possible through Jesus, even for a rock to remain on the surface of the water. Amen.